People have been asking me this question for years. Reggie, who were the greatest baseball players you ever saw, and every time somebody asks, my answer changes a little. Not because the players change, the players stay the same. What changes is the way you look at the game as you get older. When you're young, you fall in love with statistics. You look at home runs, batting averages, MVP awards, and championships. That's what I did too. But the older I got, the more I started paying attention to different things. I started thinking about the men behind the numbers, the players who made other players stop and watch, the guys who walked onto a field and somehow made the game feel bigger. I've been lucky, really lucky. I got to play against some of the greatest athletes who ever picked up a baseball bat. I stood in the batter's box against pitchers who could make your knees weak. I watched legends from the dugout. I sat in clubhouses listening to stories from men who helped build this game long before I arrived. And I'll tell you something. Baseball players don't hand out respect very easily. Fans can argue all day long about who's the greatest. Players see things differently. We know how hard this game really is. We know what it takes to survive one season, let alone 20. We know who everybody secretly admires. That's what this list is about. These aren't necessarily the players with the prettiest numbers. These are the men who left an impression on me. The men I found myself talking about long after the game ended. The men who even now still come to mind when somebody asks me about greatness. A few of them were opponents. A few were heroes when I was growing up. All of them helped shape the game that gave me everything. And the first guy I want to talk about is someone I respected long before I ever became Reggie Jackson. His name is Hank Aaron. When I think about Hank Aaron, the first thing that comes to mind isn't the home runs. I know that's probably not what most people expect me to say. After all, we're talking about one of the greatest power hitters who ever lived. But that's not what impressed me most. What impressed me was how often he showed up and did it. Year after year, season after season, no matter who was pitching, no matter what team he faced, no matter what kind of pressure surrounded him, Hank Aaron just kept producing. I never played with Hank, but like every player of my generation, I watched him closely. You couldn't help it. He was one of those guys everybody paid attention to. Not because he demanded attention, quite the opposite. Hank was never the loudest man in the room. He wasn't trying to be a celebrity. He wasn't trying to win headlines. He simply walked onto the field and went to work. And somehow that made him even more impressive. You have to understand something about baseball. Talent can get you to the major leagues. Talent can even make you a star for a few years. But staying great for 2 decades, that's something completely different. That's discipline. That's professionalism. That's a commitment most people will never understand. Hank Aaron had that. I remember talking with players over the years, and whenever Hank's name came up, the conversation was always the same. Nobody had to exaggerate. Nobody had to tell stories. The numbers spoke for themselves, and somehow they still didn't tell the whole story. Because what those numbers don't show is the pressure. Everybody remembers him chasing Babe Ruth's home run record. Today, people see the record and think of it as a baseball achievement. Back then, it was much bigger than that. Every game felt like a national event. Every swing became a headline. Every home run became a major story. Most players would have let that pressure consume them. Hank never seemed to, at least not publicly. He kept showing up. He kept doing his job. He kept carrying himself with dignity. The older I get, the more I appreciate that. When I was young, I admired players because of what they did on the field. Now I admire them for how they handled everything that came with it. Fame, expectations, criticism, pressure. Hank Aaron handled all of it better than almost anyone I've ever seen. Here's something I've always believed. If you ask 10 baseball people to build the perfect ball player, most of them would end up describing somebody who looks a lot like Hank Aaron. Power, consistency, intelligence, leadership, durability, professionalism, That's a rare combination. I've seen a lot of great players in my life. Some had more flair. Some had bigger personalities. Some generated more headlines. But when I sit here and think about the men who truly represented what greatness looks like, Hank Aaron is one of the first names that comes to mind. That's why I wanted to start with him. Now, let me tell you about a man who was completely different from Hank Aaron. If Hank was calm, Bob Gibson was intense. If Hank made the game look smooth, Bob made the game look dangerous. And believe me, when you stepped into the batter's box against him, it felt dangerous. I faced a lot of great pitchers in my life, Hall of Famers, Cy Young, winners, guys with incredible fastballs and nasty breaking balls. But Bob Gibson was different. There was something about him that you felt before he even threw the first pitch. You could see it in his eyes. You could see it in the way he carried himself. You could see it in the way he looked at hitters. Bob wasn't out there trying to impress anybody. He wasn't trying to entertain the crowd. He wasn't trying to make friends. He was trying to beat you, and he wanted you to know it. A lot of great pitchers attack hitters physically. Bob Gibson attacked them mentally before the game even started. By the time you walked to the plate, you already understood exactly what kind of afternoon you were about to have. Nothing was going to be easy. Nothing was going to be comfortable. Nothing was going to be given away. That's one of the things I respected about him. You always knew where you stood. There was no pretending. There was no smiling. There was no small talk. It was just competition, pure competition. And Bob Gibson loved competition more than almost anybody I've ever met. What people sometimes forget is how athletic he was. Fans remember the intimidation. They remember the statistics. They remember the World Series performances. But players noticed the athleticism too. Bob wasn't just a power pitcher. He was a complete athlete who happened to possess one of the fiercest competitive spirits baseball has ever seen. I remember watching him in big games and thinking he actually seemed more comfortable when the pressure increased. Some players tighten up when everything is on the line. Bob looked like he enjoyed it. The bigger the moment became, the tougher he became. That's a rare gift. And I'll be honest with you, part of me loved watching him even when I hated facing him, because players appreciate excellence. When you see somebody operating at that level, you recognize it immediately. You don't need statistics to tell you. You don't need analysts to explain it. You know, everybody knew. The other thing that stands out when I think about Bob is how much respect he earned from opponents. Not because he was friendly, not because he was popular, because he was real. What you saw was what you got. A competitor from the first inning to the ninth. A man who never backed down, a man who expected greatness from himself every time he took the mound. Looking back now, decades later, I still think about that intensity. I still think about the confidence. I still think about the feeling hitters had when they saw Bob Gibson walking toward the mound. Some players leave behind statistics. Some leave behind memories. Bob Gibson left behind both. And that's why whenever people ask me about the toughest competitors I've ever seen in this game, his name always finds its way into the conversation. Now we're getting to a player who meant something special to a lot of us. When I was growing up, Willie Mays wasn't just a baseball player. He was Willie Mays. That's the only way I know how to explain it. Some athletes become stars. Some become legends. Then every once in a while, somebody reaches a level where their name means more than the sport itself. Willie was one of those people. I remember being a young kid and watching him play. And back then, every young ball player had heroes. We all had guys we tried to imitate in the backyard, guys we pretended to be when nobody was watching. For a lot of us, that guy was Willie Mays. What amazed me about him was that he could do everything. And I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I mean literally everything. He could hit for power. He could hit for average. He could steal bases. He could play defense. He could make difficult plays look routine and routine plays look spectacular. Every team dreams of finding one player who can do all those things. Willie actually did them. That's why so many players from my generation looked up to him. When people talk about the greatest all-around player ever, Willie is always near the top of the list. Some people say Babe Ruth. Some say Mickey Mantle. Some say Hank Aaron. I understand all of those arguments. But if we're talking about a complete baseball player, the kind of guy who could beat you in every possible way, Willie belongs in that conversation every single time. What I also loved about him was the joy he brought to the game. Baseball is hard. The pressure's real. The expectations are real. The criticism is real. Sometimes players carry all of that weight on their shoulders, and you can see it every time they step onto the field. Willie never looked that way to me. He looked like somebody who genuinely loved playing baseball. And fans could feel that. Teammates could feel that. Even opponents could feel that. That's a powerful thing. People still talk about the famous over-the-shoulder catch, and they should. It's one of the greatest plays baseball has ever seen. But here's the funny thing. When I think about Willie Mays, that play isn't the first thing that comes to mind. What I remember is the complete package. I remember a player who seemed capable of affecting every inning of every game. I remember a player who inspired generations. I remember a player who made young kids believe baseball could be magic. And maybe that's why so many former players speak about him with such admiration, because Willie wasn't just great. He made other people want to be great. Looking back now, after everything I've seen in this game, I still think Willie Mays represents something special. He represents the idea that baseball can be played with excellence, confidence, creativity, and joy all at the same time. Not many players have ever pulled that off. Willie did. And every time somebody asks me about the greatest players I've ever seen, I find myself talking about him again, because some players put up numbers. Willie Mays created memories. Now, this one is personal, because before I became a major leaguer, before I became Mr. October, before anybody knew who Reggie Jackson was, I was just another kid who loved baseball. And like a lot of kids growing up during that era, I spent a lot of time watching Mickey Mantle. You have to remember what Mickey represented back then. Today, fans can watch highlights from every player in history whenever they want. Back when I was young, it wasn't like that. Legends felt larger than life. They felt almost untouchable. And Mickey Mantle was one of the biggest legends in the entire country. The Yankees were baseball royalty, and Mickey was the face of it. What struck me first was the power. Everybody talks about it, and for good reason. Mickey could hit a baseball farther than almost anyone who ever lived. There were stories about his home runs that sounded like myths. You'd hear people talking about balls leaving stadiums, reaching places nobody thought possible, and somehow the stories were usually true. But power wasn't the only thing that made him special. He could run, he could throw, he could play defense, and he could do it from both sides of the plate. As a player, I always appreciated how difficult that is. People see a switch hitter and think it's just another skill. It isn't. It's like mastering two completely different crafts at the same time. Mickey made it look easy, but it wasn't. The thing I appreciate even more now is what he accomplished while dealing with injuries. When I was younger, I mostly noticed the highlights. The older I got, the more I understood what his body was going through. His knees were never truly healthy. He played through pain that would probably keep many modern athletes off the field. Yet year after year, he remained one of the most feared hitters in baseball. That says something about his toughness. And toughness doesn't always get enough credit. People love talent because talent is easy to see. Toughness is different. Toughness shows up when nobody feels good. Toughness shows up when your body tells you to stop and you keep going anyway. Mickey had plenty of that. I also think people underestimate the pressure he lived under. Playing for the Yankees isn't like playing anywhere else. Every slump becomes front page news. Every mistake gets magnified. Every success creates even bigger expectations. For years, Mickey carried all of that. And somehow, he still became one of the defining players of his generation. Looking back now, I realize that Mickey Mantle wasn't just one of my baseball heroes. He was one of the reasons I fell in love with the game in the first place. When you're young, certain players capture your imagination. Mickey did that for me. And even after all these years, when I think about the players who made baseball feel larger than life, his name is still one of the first that comes to mind. That's something I've never forgotten. If you've listened this far, you probably already knew where I was going. Because whenever baseball people start talking about the greatest player who ever lived, sooner or later the conversation always finds its way back to Babe Ruth. I've heard every argument over the years. I've heard people say the game was different. I've heard people compare eras. I've heard fans debate statistics, competition, travel training, and everything else. You can imagine. I understand all of it. But when I think about greatness, I always come back to one simple question. Who changed baseball forever? For me, the answer has always been Babe Ruth. You have to understand what baseball looked like before him. This wasn't the game we know today. Home runs weren't the center of attention. Fans didn't come to the ballpark expecting to see somebody launch baseballs into another zip code. The sport was played differently, marketed differently, and viewed differently. Then Babe Ruth came along, and suddenly everything changed. He wasn't just winning games. He was creating excitement. People bought tickets because they wanted to see what Babe Ruth might do that day. They wanted to witness something extraordinary. They wanted stories they could tell when they got home. In a lot of ways, Babe Ruth became bigger than baseball itself. That's what separates him from almost everybody else. I've seen players dominate their era. I've seen players put together unbelievable careers. I've seen players collect awards, championships, and records. But very few athletes have changed the entire direction of a sport. Babe Ruth did. The numbers are incredible. Of course, anybody who knows baseball understands that. But if we're being honest, the numbers aren't really why he's sitting at number one for me. It's the impact. When I think about Willie Mays, I think about the complete player. When I think about Mickey Mantle, I think about the hero I watched as a kid. When I think about Hank Aaron, I think about consistency and professionalism. When I think about Bob Gibson, I think about competitiveness and intimidation. When I think about Babe Ruth, I think about baseball. That's the difference. His shadow still stretches across the game nearly a century later. Every slugger who steps into a batter's box owes something to Babe Ruth. Every fan who loves the excitement of a towering home run is enjoying something Ruth helped make popular. Every superstar who becomes bigger than the sport itself is following a path that Babe helped create. That's an incredible legacy. And I'll tell you something else. The older I get, the more I appreciate people who leave a lasting mark on the world. Records eventually get broken. Statistics eventually get debated. New generations come along and create new stars. But changing a sport forever, that's rare. That's what Babe Ruth did. So when people ask me who the greatest baseball player of all time is, I don't hesitate. I think about all the legends I've admired. I think about all the incredible players I've watched. And somehow I always end up back at the same answer. For me, it starts with Babe Ruth. And after all these years, it still ends there too. Would everybody agree with my list? Probably not. That's part of what makes baseball great. Every fan has their own heroes, and every generation has its own legends. But when I look back on this game that gave me so much, these are the 5 names that come to mind first. Hank Aaron, Bob Gibson, Willie Mays, Mickey Mantle, Babe Ruth. I've spent my entire life around baseball, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that greatness comes in different forms. But those 5 men left a mark on this game that will never disappear. And honestly, I think baseball is better because they were here. You know, sitting here and talking about these players reminds me how lucky I've been. Most people spend their lives watching history. Somehow I got to live around it. I got to watch legends perform. I got to compete against some of the toughest men this game has ever produced. I got to learn from players who set standards that the rest of us spent our careers trying to reach. And that's really what this list is about. It's not about proving who was better than who. It's not about winning an argument. It's about recognizing the players who left a lasting impression on me after all these years. When I think about Hank Aaron, I think about consistency and professionalism. When I think about Bob Gibson, I think about intensity and competitive fire. When I think about Willie Mays, I think about joy and complete greatness. When I think about Mickey Mantle, I think about the hero who inspired a generation of young ball players. And when I think about Babe Ruth, I think about the man who changed the game forever. Every one of them taught baseball something. Every one of them gave fans memories that lasted a lifetime. And every one of them helped make this sport what it is today. The funny thing about getting older is that your perspective changes. When I was young, I focused on records. I focused on awards. I focused on who won and who lost. Now I find myself appreciating something else. I appreciate the players who made people care, the players who filled stadiums, the players who inspired kids to pick up a bat for the first time, the players whose stories are still being told decades after they played their final game. That's real greatness. And if we're still talking about these men all these years later, maybe that's the best proof of all, because baseball never really forgets its greatest players. Neither do the people who love the game. Thank you for listening to an old ball player share a few memories. Looking back now, I realize how fortunate I was to witness these legends. And honestly, if I could go back and watch them all over again, I'd buy the ticket in a heartbeat.